Hello, everybody. This is Stephen Whitfield with Drilling Contractor. We are at the 2025 IADC Drilling Onshore Conference in Houston, Texas. And with me right now is a man who spoke at this conference, David Wilbur of the Vetergy Group. He gave a presentation on a new way to look at human factors, sort of talking about the interactions of systems and people, and just sort of the shift that needs to take place in order to better understand how things happen. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, get some great insight from him. So David, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Stephen. It's good to be with you.
So one thing that really struck me in your presentation was this sort of look at these sort of human-dominated systems, right? And you mentioned the interfaces between assets, process, and people, and why that's sort of important for us to understand those interactions in order to better understand sort of human factors. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, Stephen. I suppose the point would be is that when we're thinking in systems, we're not studying the individual agents themselves because they don't tell the whole story. Systems, as I mentioned, and particularly the systems we're talking about, human-dominated, deal with high risk, high consequence, and complex systems that they are. If we look at different components like the people, the assets, or the process itself, and study that component in isolation, and then we expect when we put them together that we can assume that that system will operate, we lose sight of the actual system dynamics, and we focus on sort of component level, and we miss out on the fact that those interactions between those domains that I talked about are actually what drives systemic performance. So we need to look at that way in order to understand why the system behaved the way it did, why it produced the result that it produced, and what we can do to improve it.
Another thing that seemed critical to your presentation here was this idea of sound judgment. Yeah. Now, you know, the term sound judgment, I'm sure if you're thinking about it, it's like, well, of course, sound judgment. You must exercise sound judgment. But there's a very specific term that you're using, and I want you to kind of define it, and why is that such a critical part of this sort of new way of thinking?
Yeah, well, first off, let me address the way you asked the question as part of the challenge that we have to understand. And when you said, of course, we expect you, meaning a person inside the organization, to exercise sound judgment, we're immediately discounting what we just talked about at that systemic level of interface. So when we say sound judgment, I want you to think of sound judgment as a component of a system, not as an attribute of a person. But the person is the only systemic attribute that possesses the capacity for sound judgment, simply meaning that when we are faced with something different than what we expected, a variation in the operating conditions, something didn't match the plan, then the only dimension, the only attribute within this system that can make a decision and take an action that may be not compliant with the rules, the plans, or not consistent with the rules and the plans, and achieve the outcome that we're looking for is the human component. But again, that sound judgment is not a personal attribute. Notice I didn't say good judgment. I didn't say bad judgment. I said the soundness of judgment is derived by the system, not just the person. There's a very simple analogy everyone is usually familiar with. When you think about Sully Sullenberger and The Miracle on the Hudson, there's movies created about this idea that he made decisions and took actions in the moment that were outside of plan, and yet they achieved a result where only a few people got wet, arguably, as a result of an Airbus going into the Hudson River. But the other consequence could have been much, much, much worse, all because he exercised and the system itself, the training that he had, the culture where he could act, the support that he received from the other crew members allowed sound judgment to be produced by this system.
Okay, well that's quite interesting, a quite interesting concept. And to sort of extrapolate that further, in your presentation, you sort of describe sound judgment as a key component of this operational juncture. Yeah. And I want you to kind of get into that a little bit because there were so many components within that. Maybe it's hard to distill that within a couple of minutes here, but can you sort of tell us how that all works?
Of course. Well, first off, as I said, just to pick up on the idea of the operational juncture, is what we're trying to do now is take The fact that we have this sound judgment as a result of a person, and people operating inside of a system are not contingent. They're not linear. We can't say this causes this every single time. People operate in a very non-linear way, in very multidimensional way, informed by a lot of different variables. But we need to find a way to sort of scientifically describe and define how we can observe and measure human performance within this nonlinear environment. So if we say, how do we observe? What is the minimum unit? What is the thing that we can consistently say, well, there's human performance. I see it. This is human performance. It is when a people or a group of people or a person makes a decision and takes an action as a result of that decision that they made, and that action has a measurable outcome, an observable outcome. Somebody turned a valve, and when they turned that valve, something happened as a result of that. They decided, they acted, they turned the valve, and now we know what that outcome was, and we compare that outcome to the outcome we were looking for. And if that was the right outcome, then we presume that was the right thing to do. If it was a wrong outcome, we want to understand why. So now what we're trying to do is take a world we live in, which is and the way we think about the world logically is that it's contingent, it's cause and effect. This causes this effect. If we can trace that out, we can find out where it went wrong. That doesn't happen. That is not the real world that we live in as human beings. So we need to take a non-linear, multidimensional measure of analysis of human performance, which we call the operational juncture.
So all of these things that we're talking about sort of indicate a shift in the way that we think about human factors. And, I would think from an organizational standpoint, the first question I would have if I was leading an organization is, well, what do I do to start this shift? What steps can I take? Do you have anything that you would suggest companies do?
Yeah, first off, just think differently. Adopt this idea. As I mentioned in the presentation, now is the time. The reason now is the time is because technology has evolved, margins have become tighter, the markets are much more dynamic and uncertain, and we've gotten what we can get out of the legacy thinking about human performance, which was control-based. Prescribe, control people, try to mitigate the risk rather than exploit the resource of the judgment ability of people. And that comes from a very different source. So exploiting that starts with thinking a little bit differently about human performance, becoming curious about it, and then have conversations. Because in the world of resilience that we talk about and human performance, this is not a major capital project. We are not going to abandon the way we've thought about human performance in the past. We're going to exploit a new aspect of that. So it starts with thinking differently. It starts with leaders asking different questions and being more curious about systemic performance than they are about individual performance, and understanding their contribution, the full contribution to that outcome. How you do that can be as simple as a leadership workshop, which we use very often, to get everybody together. Why that's important and profoundly shifting in terms of the way we think is if we come to a shared understanding of these ideas that we talk about, inconsistencies that require sound judgment, where these inconsistencies are, and involving the people, that in and of itself, very small shift, big impact in terms of organizational performance. We create that, we activate that, that is a starting point or a launching point for what becomes a much bigger change in curiosity, systems thinking, thinking differently about people, and seeing the results of that. And the one other thing, as we talked about in that slide, where operational junctures interact with others, the one most essential thing that most organizations can do immediately is stop ending investigations at human performance error. Operator failed to follow procedure, operator did this, blame the operator, retrain the operator, write a procedure that says to follow the procedure next time, layer on bureaucracy, or worst case, discipline the operator. It doesn't mean the operator doesn't have some culpability in the decision and the action that was made, but the system is more interesting, more opportunistic to involve and improve. So don't stop at operator error ever again. Go beyond operator error. Use human factors analysis in order to study, understand the systemic influences that caused the operator to make that error because it made sense to them at the time, and solve those inconsistencies.
Well, that is definitely a new way to think about human factors, and one that I will have to wrap my head around a little bit. That's really interesting to hear all of this, David. Thank you so much for talking to us about it.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
And thank you for visiting drillingcontractor.org.